So my question is about, you said that in Rwanda, the dis- benefits were distributed outside of the existing welfare system. I'm very curious about this. Were any other kinds of identity cards given, any kind of data generated about who accessed the information and so on? Because, and was it linked with health data at any point? And secondly, thanks for the talking about the urban-rural thing, because this is something we observed in India as well. Usually people migrate to urban India because you can always find work, which is very difficult in rural areas. But at the same time, there's a community in rural India. So this really turned the logic around and there was widespread hunger in India, which activists and investigative journalists noted that was quite rare. Like, you don't have that kind of widespread hunger in urban India, but that was something we had in 2020 and 2021. So thanks for talking about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Fee Clark, for your presentation. And I would like to know, listening to you and to the case of Rwanda, if we can draw a kind of model that reflects a correlation between a political regime and the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, can we say that the more authoritarian a regime is, then more is it prepared to find good solutions in terms of combating COVID-19? Thank you.
So thank you very much. Again, we are seeing the Rwandan government acting, well, on its own, maybe. But the question I wanted to ask is, you're using the sledgehammer for what? What drove that kind of drastic measures? Because one should think that when you have a fire, you can deploy certain appliances to take it off. And again, it will raise quite a lot of questions that when you look at countries, people want to see what they're doing or what they seem to be doing right or wrong. And what do you think, could be driving that kind of attitude? Or, did they go overboard? And of course, I wasn't surprised that there should be effect on the economy, because if you considering what was done in Rwanda, there will be lots of ripple effects, and the economy suffered. Originality of actions will mean that you want to look at how things are faring with the people, having the people in mind. We weren't fighting World War, for instance. Of course, for COVID, it was like a war. So I thought that we're still seeing some copying and pasting. Maybe, okay, how did it happen in this country with severe? And so I don't know, maybe you can just shed some light on that, and how far the people were considered in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And it's interesting, this element of the shifting in the dynamic of the relationship between the rural and the urban areas, which you talked about, Phil, and was also discussed, I think, mentioned by Riva as well. And I just wondered, Jignesh Nashik, I'd like to ask you, did you, because you mentioned that when the rural migrants returned, there's been a big increase in unemployment, big decrease in wages, and did everybody return from rural areas? Have people who have found it very hard in the post-COVID urban setting, some of them returned again? What are the dynamics there? Is there a kind of a shift, as Phil suggested there was in Rwanda?
So Phil, Andrew said, great presentation on Rwanda, thank you. It looks like the very strict restrictions in Kigali may have prevented COVID-19 having much impact on the rest of the country. Can this be seen as a success and a positive for Rwanda as a whole? If there had been better compensation in Kigali, perhaps the food insecurity experience could have been reduced. which was entirely something the government could have done if they'd wanted to. He then finishes, I also wonder about the effects on children in Rwanda. Can you speak about school closures, maybe urban and rural?
So thank you for the excellent questions, and I suggest that Phil take these questions first, and Ginex and his colleagues will complement and give us some views on India too.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those questions. They're fantastic. Yeah, let me start with Reva's question. So there wasn't a huge amount of specific health data gathered during the pandemic itself because there's so much micro health data gathered amongst the Rwandan population at the best of times. So, what we saw really during the pandemic was the government trying to predict some of its measures on what it already thought it knew about the population. I mean, one of the things that I think is quite remarkable about Rwanda is just how forensic the household by household weekly gathering of behavioral data is that the government undertakes. So one of the ways this manifests is that the local officials will do what they call hygiene checks of every household in the country every Friday. But the hygiene check is more than just a hygiene check. It's about how people are behaving. It's about the neatness of your property. Are you behaving according to the norms that the ruling party would expect? And is there dissent building in any pocket of the population? So the government already knows a huge amount about who is sick and who isn't, really at that very kind of micro level. And so what we saw during the pandemic was those hygiene checks stopped, but the government felt that it already knew the dynamics within households, and so it was trying to develop a lot of its measures on that basis. There wasn't a lot of kind of new information gathering as such. In terms of coming back to the urban-rural dynamics, one of the crucial impacts of COVID in Kigali in particular, and this was something that I was asking people about during the pandemic and subsequently, was how much the government's lack of response to people's food insecurity left them with a real sense of abandonment by the state. And I mean, the way that I kind of theorize this is that I think it has really shaken a kind of Rwandan social contract that has built up since the genocide. And if I were to condense that social contract, it is that the government expects the population will put up with a lot of repression and a lot of intrusion for the sake of a government that keeps them secure and continues to provide in socioeconomic terms. And that's a situation that is basically held since 1994. This is the concept of illiberal welfare. You'll swallow the illiberal bit because we're providing the welfare. Well, COVID really shook that in Kigali. People who may have felt that the state was providing for them up until then, in their hour of greatest need, felt completely abandoned. And I think it has really altered citizen-state relations as a result. An equilibrium that had developed in Rwanda over 30 years was really undermined in that period, leading to a lot of discontent and a lot of anger. So, and that continues up until the present. I mean, even doing some research back in Rwanda about a month ago, those sort of attitudes are very prevalent, especially in the city. So that's a long-term political and social repercussion of. But I would say that is much stronger in Kigali than it is in the countryside. There's a very clear political differentiation here between how COVID played out in the city and how it played out in the countryside, which I think then links to Carlos's question around, can we see a correlation between political regime type and response to COVID? And I think my immediate answer is yes, in the sense that most of what the Rwandan government did responding to COVID was things that the Rwandan government does anyway. Things like police and military patrols, especially in Kigali, are commonplace. They happen during the Genocide Commemoration Month in April. They happen whenever there is an increase in violence in Eastern Congo. So the Rwandan state used an apparatus that it was pretty familiar with in that respect. But if I look regionally, there were some anomalies that maybe disrupt this easy correlation between regime type and response. So, especially under Nkurunziza, I would argue that Burundi is as authoritarian as Rwanda. And yet what we saw in Burundi was a completely laissez-faire approach to COVID. And as a result, I mean, Nkurunziza said early on in the pandemic that he didn't believe COVID existed. There was absolute COVID denial in Burundi, and they paid a very, very heavy price for that. The COVID numbers were drastic in Burundi. And of course, most of the international data can't capture that because there was no reporting by the Burundian state. And as we know, Nkurunziza also then died of COVID-related repercussions. So there was perhaps a bit of divine retribution there. Tanzania under Magufuli, I mean, Tanzania tends to be quite a democratic state, but it was heading in a very authoritarian direction under Magufuli. Magufuli's response to COVID was almost exactly the same as Nkurunziza's. And the pattern of COVID escalation in Tanzania was very similar to Burundi's in that sense. So you've got two, I would say, repressive states there that took a completely different approach to COVID and in my view, paid quite a heavy price. Which maybe links directly to Andrew Shepherd's. I'm gonna answer Wellington's questions over here, but let me link this to Andrew's point because I think there's it's a natural segue because as critical as I am of the stringency of Rwanda's lockdown measures, I think they went too far. They put enormous socioeconomic pressure on people. It has disrupted the social contract. It's got long-term consequences that we still can't fully grasp. What Rwanda did achieve was exactly what you say, Andrew, which was a containment strategy. That COVID basically never got out of the city. So the countryside was able to live this parallel existence because of that very effective strategy. Rwanda was also incredibly organized when it came to the vaccine rollout. I mean, this is the flip side of an authoritarian regime. Not all authoritarian regimes are like this, but the Rwandan authoritarian regime has a startlingly effective bureaucracy. And it's a small landlocked country. So you can mobilize things like a vaccine very, very quickly in a way that you can't in other places. And so I think there was some success there, but the problem, and I think Andrew's question hints at this, is that there was no offset strategy for the negative consequences of that approach. And that, I think, would, in many respects, have been acceptable to many everyday Rwandans, especially in Kigali. I think many people perhaps would have accepted the stringency of the lockdowns had there been more effective food distribution, had there been the upkeep of the welfare system that they had come to appreciate over decades. And they probably would have lived with this massive government intrusion, which is the kind of government intrusion that they tend to live with anyway, had this other part of the equation been dealt with. The failure to do that, I think, was a massive mistake, and it's got long-term repercussions. In terms of children, this is something that I know some colleagues at the University of Rwanda are looking at the moment, because the big failure in the Rwandan welfare system is in education. The welfare system is very strong in terms of healthcare. It has continued to struggle in terms of education standards. So Rwanda has focused on primary school registration, but hasn't done very much about the quality of education, and that was preceding COVID. The school closures in particular during COVID then saw a sort of an increase in educational deficit for most children. But I don't think yet we know the specifics of exactly how that's played out. But I think it would be fairly obvious that the situation for Rwandan children is incredibly negative. The final thing I'll say, in terms of the question over here, about what drove these drastic measures in the Rwandan case, I think it's two things. So one is, it's part of the ruling party, the RPF's default response to a major crisis, which is they respond in a heavy-handed, immediate, forthright fashion with the whole apparatus of the state, including the military, at their disposal. One of the ways that played out was in the first weeks of the pandemic, Kagame kept using this language. He kept saying, COVID is this country's biggest threat since the genocide. He used that word threat very, very clearly, and it was understood very clearly by most Rwandans. What it meant was it justified a state securitizing the COVID situation. We talked yesterday about the militarization of COVID. In Rwanda, I would say it was the securitization of COVID. We see this as a security threat. If COVID gets out of control, it will undermine social cohesion. It will disrupt our relations with our neighbors. This is an already volatile region with bad blood between countries. It's a security threat, and therefore it justifies a security response. which is the kind of thing that the RPF is very prone to do. So that's the first bit. It's a kind of RPF default. But the second aspect was an international dimension. One of the things that was driving the Rwandan state all the way through COVID was that they were due to host the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM, and it had been delayed twice because of COVID. So much of the national economy had been tilted towards the hosting of CHOGM. This was the biggest event that Rwanda had ever hosted in an economy that is 30% based on tourism and conference hosting. So much of the COVID response was geared towards making Rwanda palatable to the heads of state and their entourages who were going to come to Rwanda. And this was picked up by much of the local population in Kigali. They knew that a lot of this is being done for outsiders. This is partly being done for us, but it's also got an eye on the hosting of this major event, which is so economically and politically important. So there is always an international dimension to this, but I know there's an entire panel on international components later today, so I'm sure we're going to talk about that more. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't know if you heard Professor Green's question.
Yeah,
Trisha, you're here as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I did, and
Good.
yeah, I mean, the time Professor Toby, we were engaging in Kapashira. It's like a border, Delhi and Haryana state, and this is just at the border. And Kapashira is a pure migrant hub where the time we engaged, a lot of laborers were staying back, and they had sent their families back to the native places. Okay, and when we were engaging, and I was going around Kapashira, they stayed back because now these are skilled workers which are working in the export line. These are tailors, highly skilled workers. Without them, the industry won't work. And they stayed back and they allowed the family to go. So few stayed back, and then later they also went back because the in-laws were worried about them. Once things were a little open, they couldn't afford to pay for private buses, and also government facilities were quite shattered. So yeah, so some migrants were there, Professor Toby, if I'm right to answer your question.
Yeah. No, just to very quickly add, I think there are two kinds of community sense of belonging that the low-income migrant workers that we were able to talk to share. One is of care responsibilities, which they find was more prevalent in the village, hometowns, the rural spaces. I think the distinction of the rural-urban is also not very clear when you start sort of traveling now in much of the village areas. Much of the villages are no longer working as quote-unquote traditionally as agrarian households. A lot of them are trying to pivot to open up new places of work or find new places of work. There's a huge occupational change. And as you know that in the employment statistics, 80% of the self-employed category of even informally organized work is largely in the rural area, which is through street vendors trying to set up new forms of businesses. So many people who went back to rural areas, or that is native villages, some of them decided to stay back, but the percentage of that was temporarily limited for 6 months maximum. Ultimately, almost everyone came back. In the Kapashira case study, reason why this is so pivotal is because most of the low-income migrant force that tends to settle down in Delhi for a long period of time, which is 5 years to 7 years to 10 years, ultimately somewhere finds home here. And this is something we realized while talking to people who've been there for like 30, 35, 40 years. And the communal sense of living or belonging there is more on survival management and survival skills. So it's not as if the feeling of community is missing, that community is still there, which is where they're staying. They come all together, but it's monetized. It's also something where there's that rent-seeking behavior that Jignesh and Trisha were talking about. But there is that sense that if you're living here for work and your ends have to be managed, we're there to take care of that. But the care, the sense of care responsibility, if something goes wrong, you're losing health, or you're finding much more of problems with family care responsibilities. So many households would tend to sort of move them back to their villages. I think that's an interesting sort of a mix in the COVID shift, that the nature of care responsibility, care work, has sort of pivoted a lot away. Women, as you were saying, were finding a lot more instances of anemia. I think this is a point which has to be much more studied beyond public health domain, because it's affecting their ability to work, contribute to extra household responsibilities. And in South Asia, I think the NFHS data recently that brought out pointed at glaring statistics on the high risk of anemia across women. And that's a real trouble. And Kapashera, the organization that is working with us, is trying to do. So one small thing just before we close, I would say, is that some of these clusters that you saw yesterday and today, these are live ethnographic projects. So if anybody amongst you was to visit India at any point of time, we're happy to sort of facilitate a visit with the field researchers. The students work as field correspondents. So if in case you're there at any point of time, please let us know, give it a shout. We'll be happy to take you. Thank you. Thank you.